Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the first Dime webinar of 2021. We have made it. Welcome, everyone, to the other side. Thanks for being patient, too, as we were getting some technical difficulties worked out, but we have no doubt that today is going to be a fantastic presentation today. I am thrilled to host Megan Zweig, the Chief Operating Officer of Rock Health, to bring their Diversity and Digital Health 2020 report to us today. Before we get started, of course, we've got to move forward with some housekeeping here. So as you can see that today's session is being recorded. And so slides will be available as well as the recording will be available on the Dime website after today's live presentation. And a lot of the beauty of our live events is the interaction with the participants. So at any point, please, of course, raise your hand or type your questions in the chat window. And I can also unmute you if you'd like to ask your questions live to myself and to Megan. And of course, you can type your questions into the chat box. So move on ahead here. But we'll go ahead and get started, the reason that we're all here today. So Megan, would you mind introducing yourself and Rock Health, and we'll jump right into your presentation.
Yeah, of course, Rachel. Really appreciate you having me. It's great to be with your community. So again, I'm Megan Zweig. I've been with Rock Health now for a few years, and we do two things. We invest in early stage startups in digital health, and we advise large organizations. So through our consulting, through our membership program, we work with large organizations, whether it's health systems, health plans, biopharma, even some non-healthcare players, telecom, retail, to advise them on their innovation and digital health strategies, and of course, connect them into the investor and startup community. So we really feel that those two parts of our business are synergistic, that we are better supporters of our portfolio companies when we have those close relationships with enterprise, and we can be better advisors to enterprise when we have a really close look and close relationships with the startup ecosystem. So that's a little bit about us. We also are really grateful for the network and community around Rock Health. So it's exciting to be able to connect with yours, and I'm sure there's a lot more that that we'll be doing together. Do you want me to go ahead and jump into the presentation for today? Perfect. So you may be wondering, what are we going to talk about today? We, as Rock Health, we really committed ourselves early to thinking through how we make an impact when it comes to gender equity. And so you may have seen year over year, we generally put out a report looking at women representation among healthcare startups, among large healthcare enterprise companies, whether that's at the executive or board level, and also looking at representation among investors. And we found a huge gap. This has been widely written about. I think Oliver Wyman just put out a really great report digging into some of the reasons for that. But you see, immense representation of women in healthcare jobs, but not necessarily at senior levels. And that's despite the prominent role that women are playing when it comes to their own, not just their own healthcare decisions, but the healthcare decisions of their family. And so we put a lot of effort into thinking about how do we improve that representation, invest in female founders as investors, making sure that we're intentional about representation at our own events, and digging up best practices from our own portfolio community and sharing that out. 2020 was different. Really early in the year, I think February, March, we started chatting with Dr. Ivor Horn, who's really committed so much of her career to racial equity. And we decided that this was the year that we really wanted to look at diversity in a more expansive lens, going beyond gender and really honing in on what racial and ethnic diversity looks like in digital health. We honed in on what does representation look like among startup leadership, because we really want to work towards a more inclusive community, and a community that is really, supporting particularly founders of color. And so we wanted to better baseline the space. What does diversity look like right now? And what are some of the kind of challenges that emerge when we started to be curious about the different experiences across different groups of innovators? So Rachel, you can go ahead and just flip to the next slide. So thanks to anybody on the call who may have taken our survey. We put out a survey across the summer in 2020. We had 678 respondents. So those respondents were leaders at US-based digital health companies, managers and above. We were super intentional about how we anonymized the information, because we knew that we were asking for, sensitive individual information. We asked about race and ethnicity. We asked about sexual orientation, gender, as well as some, in-depth questions about challenges that folks may have faced based on their experience as innovators. So we are not reporting the data, of course, at an individual level. We are not reporting the data at a company or a fund level. We are reporting the data in aggregate. And that was very intentional on our part to help drum up response rate. So what I'll kind of go through, these are the colors that you're going to see throughout the slides. It's a lot of colors and numbers, so we can certainly share the slides and follow up. But just wanted to take you through, we did find that kind of representation among the 678 people that took our survey relatively mirrored the census when it came to gender. So those are the two bars on the left. We had 48% of men, people who identified as men, take the survey. 49% were women, and then about 3% either identify as non-binary or decided not to disclose their gender. The numbers were slightly different when it came to comparing race and ethnicity to US Census data. You can see largely consistent in terms of people that identify as white, slightly fewer within our sample that identify as Black, more significantly fewer people who identify as Hispanic, and then a larger proportion of people in our survey that identify as Hispanic relative to the US Census. So you can already start to see where there may potentially be some gaps in representation of digital health leadership. So getting into more of the interesting data, if we go ahead and flip to the next slide, again, we started to analyze this in a way to understand what are the different experiences. This slide is showing the experience of founders specifically. So I said the whole survey included managers and above. This data cut is just founders. And we started to ask, where are these folks located? And what does capital look like flowing to that space? So what's interesting is, we think of a lot of concentration of investors and capital in the West. When you look at the kind of racial and ethnic makeup of founders who completed our survey, whose companies are headquartered in the West, much more likely to be white or Asian, kind of lower representation among Black and Hispanic founders. That changes when you look at the Midwest and particularly the South. So you have the greatest proportion of Black representation among founders in the South with about 38%. And I think what was pretty stark is that when we looked at the raw numbers, yes, there are fewer founders overall in the South who took our survey. But what we found is that there were actually more Black founders in the South than in the West and the Northeast combined. And so when we start to think about how investors may want to diversify their deal flow, I think one, silver lining of COVID is it's allowed us to think more about who we can connect with, have meetings with, not just in person, but anyone really anywhere. And so this was a really powerful finding for us to think about, again, how do we diversify that network of entrepreneurs that we're tapping into funding, especially when so many investors are based in the West and are going to be more likely to see founders that probably look like them if they're just sourcing from their own backyard. The numbers here represent the amount of funding in 2020 that flowed to founders in these regions. So you can also see, and this is this is kind of the cumulative total of funding, I think, through H2 of 2020. And so you can see that there are a lot more dollars flowing to the West and the Northeast. And so again, raising questions about disparities when it comes to access to capital. Another way that we slice this data, and again, started to understand the experience of different groups, if we go ahead and look at the next slide, was asking about how some of these companies are funded. So we asked, again, this was just our founder respondents, and then we broke them down by race and ethnicity. We asked them, how are you funding your company? Are you venture-backed? Are you angel backed? So, maybe having completed a family and friends round, an angel round, or have you bootstrapped your company? Or are you using some other funding mechanism such as a loan? The results here were pretty stark. So white and Asians being the most likely to report that they are venture backed, especially relative to Black founder respondents. And if we actually flip to the next slide, the data becomes even more stark. So we started thinking about intersectional identities. And I actually should have said up front, we didn't do too many intersectional identities cut across the course of the survey, simply because our ends, the number of respondents, started to get pretty small. And so it starts to be difficult to do deeper analysis. But where we could do intersectional analysis was looking at both race and ethnicity as well as gender. So now the 3 bars on the left-hand side correspond to men founders who took the survey. On the right is women founders. And when we broke those groups down by different races and ethnicities, you'll see Hispanic isn't on here because the N just got too small to report out that data. But the message is even starker here than on the prior slide. So you can see that Black women are less likely than particularly white men and Asian men to be venture backed, and they are significantly more likely to have bootstrapped their company. And so this starts to get at what we've heard from founders anecdotally. It starts to get at some of the literature that we've looked at in terms of Black and brown founders not necessarily having access to that kind of initial family and friends or angel round, and it becoming increasingly difficult to access capital in later stages of the game. And so this was super eye-opening for me because at Rock Health, we track data on who's raising funding, what types of companies are raising funding. I'm sure many of you have seen, we put out a quarterly report on that. And we've always found that only about 15 to maybe 17% of those companies are led by women. And so we've always asked, wait, this feels off. There isn't an 80-20 in terms of men starting companies versus women. But I think what this data is showing is when you cast a broader net beyond just venture-backed companies, you're seeing that a lot of women are going a different route, whether it's loans, whether it's, a lot of them bootstrapping their companies, in part likely because of some access issues that they're reporting when it comes to raising capital. And I know I want to get into the discussion, so I'll go through these next few slides relatively quickly. But if we flip to the next one, this gets at this point that I'm making where we asked people, what are some of the barriers to being an innovator? And so this is representative of kind of any founder, any senior leader that took our survey. The different bars represent different races and ethnicities. And so we asked them, to what degree do you feel the following factors, so access to capital, diverse talent, insights from end users, access to investors and mentors, has been a barrier in building your company? So the higher the bar, the greater the barrier this group perceives this to be an issue. It's relatively stable. When we ran some statistical analyses, there weren't many significant differences. So I think what this is telling us is, being an entrepreneur, being an innovator is tough. There are going to be challenges across the board. The ones that did spike, though, when you look at the mint green bar, which represents our Black respondents, there was a greater sense that access to capital, access to investors was more difficult. And I think that speaks to the data that we just saw on the last slide, where those folks are also less likely to be venture backed and to go an alternative route like bootstrapping. And I should say, like, this is not me advising not to bootstrap. I think bootstrapping is incredibly powerful. If you can build a company and bootstrapped, like, my God, more power to you, maintaining that ownership. But at the same time, in healthcare, we know that getting to scale is incredibly important, and there are a lot of hurdles to it. So investing in a sales force for enterprise sales, investing in clinical validation, investing in overcoming kind of regulatory hurdles. Just being able to find product market fit can oftentimes require a lot of capital investment. And so if you don't have access to that venture capital, it can be a real barrier to the growth that a lot of these companies are experiencing. And it can be a means of, getting behind the pack in terms of competition. So just wanted to call that out. But bootstrapping still very much a viable option for those that want to go that path. The next slide, we also just wanted to generally ask people, get a pulse check on how people are feeling about inclusion in the digital health industry. So again, broke all of our respondents out by race and ethnicity and just asked them, do you think the digital health industry has become more inclusive since you started working? These results were really sobering. You can see, so the yellow part of the bar means it's the same. The gray is it's worse or a lot worse. And then minty green is it's slightly better. And then dark green is it's a lot better. So you can see that among kind of white respondents, much greater likelihood than Black respondents, for instance, to say that, things are slightly better or a lot better. Versus, over 25% of Black respondents reported that things are worse or even a lot worse. So again, really important to be cognizant of these different experiences. And I think that if we flip to the next slide, it also reinforces this point where we ask folks, do you see your company's leadership having accountability for DEI, for diversity, equity, and inclusion? And again, we saw that same difference that we just saw, this difference between how white people are reporting their experience versus kind of the highest contrast is to Black respondents. So, vast majority of white people saying, yes, like, I think our company's leaders are committed to DEI. In fact, 66%. Compared to just about a third of Black respondents who said, yes, like, I believe that our company's leadership has clear accountability. I will say, as one of the survey writers, that we didn't explicitly define what accountability means. That was in the eye of the reader. And so there may have been different interpretations of, what does accountability really look like? So the final slide gets at this idea of community and the power that community can potentially have in making connections, in offering advice. I don't want to over-index on that because I think part of the conversation is that oftentimes Black and Brown founders, I was just reading a quote yesterday, can be over-mentored and underfunded. And so there is this also kind of call of hire and wire, like, we need to hire more diverse people. Like, wire is like, fund, like, make sure that you are funding all different types of founders that are solving all different types of problems in healthcare. But I did want to share this data because I think it speaks to the importance of community, particularly for certain groups. So we asked folks, and again, this is looking at an intersectional identity, men on the left, women on the right, breaking it down by race and ethnicity again. Sorry, I'm sounding like a broken record, but you all are catching on. So men kind of overall less likely to be a part of a professional diversity network or support group, women more likely than men, and especially Black women. Most likely 93% of kind of Black women respondents, we had 29, were a part of a professional diversity network or support group. On the bottom, those little kind of pie charts are showing to what extent that community has helped you in your career. Relatively, I'd say like lukewarm to good results because it was on a scale of 1 to 5, but Black women kind of ranking the support that they've received from those groups as the highest. So again, perhaps not surprising when we saw that Black women were also the least likely to be venture backed. And so, this group, of course, finding mentorship, I think support from each other. And I think, we've heard from founders that, I'm thinking back to Derek, some of you may have been at Rock Health Summit. There, the head of Queerly mentioned that, when they were first showing up in some of these spaces in digital health, it didn't really feel like a place that they were necessarily a part of or belonged. And so finding a community where they did feel like they belong, and then kind of having the recognition that, I'm building for an incredibly important population, in their case, the LGBTQ plus community. And, I am now a part of this, and my presence is incredibly important for also signaling to others that this is a space that that we're all going to make our own. So just wanted to end with this point that I think that mentorship and support can be an incredibly helpful outlet, and one that a lot of people are already leveraging. Okay, I see, Rachel, I see that we have some, I'm not reading all the comments and questions, but I see that we have some rolling in. So wanted to hand things back over to you. Of course, happy to go deeper on any of this data, and I'll just give a quick plug. The full report, which has, probably 15 more graphs and some additional analysis, is available on the Rock Health website, available to download for anyone. So certainly encourage folks that may want to use some of this data in a presentation, bring to your team, look a little deeper with us to take a look.
Megan, oh my gosh, thank you for bringing all this wonderful, thank you first of all for you and your team for this excellent research, very important for everyone. This all makes everything better for patients, which is of course the reason that we do anything that we do. I do want to bring to the next slide here. Right here are a lot of resources that Megan has shared, Rock Health has shared, and some that Dime has collected too here, which is also resources for minority founders. So we don't want to just sit here today and talk about perhaps the bleak current. We'd like to also talk about ways to make things better in the future. We can't make anything better, of course, unless we benchmark and call things out for the way that they are, but we're excited for the future here. So there are some resources here for minority founders, and of course, these slides will be available afterwards and freely accessible here. You can also do a quick little screen grab if you need it right now and you want to Google it right after this presentation, but this will be available. We wanted to make sure that this was part of the presentation today.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll give a little plug. California Healthcare Foundation did some great work and actually created, it's just a really nicely organized resource. They have an Airtable that consolidates even kind of more resources, whether it's funds that focus on founders of color, whether it's accelerator incubator programs that focus on women or founders of color. It's also a really nice spot to comb through some of those resources. And they also kind of did their own report, it kind of explaining in depth some more of what I was sharing, and then also getting into a few of the tactics that they've seen be most effective, kind of funding diverse founders, offering more mentorship and coaching, and then also for venture funds being more intentional about tracking the diversity of their deal flow as well as their portfolio companies. So really some really awesome resources here too.
Fantastic. Thanks, Megan. I also went ahead and dropped some of the links for this in the chat.
Awesome.
For folks to go ahead and access now. This is also very important, very timely. But so thank you again for your fantastic presentation. I I'm so excited. I have so many questions here, but I do want to put this slide up for just a moment as a reminder that here's some contact information for Megan, and we've also reached the super fun Q&A portion of this. And now I know a lot of us are joining today with a personal interest in this, and also because we just want to see the world be a little bit better. And so please think of your questions, drop them in the chat. And I will also ask if I can unmute you to ask your question live. We like this to be a collaborative conversation. So I'll stop sharing right now. And I'd like to actually turn the first question to Katie Jenkins. Let's see here. Katie, are you able to unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Sure can. Katie, go ahead. Can you go ahead and ask your question? Thanks for joining.
Sure. Megan, thank you so much. This was really great presentation. It's something that's personally very interesting to me. And I'm curious if you have any data about the patients and the populations that these companies and these founders service, because I think I would be curious about the extent that impacts that, a lack of diversity or differences in diversity have from in a company level, what the downstream impact is on patients and customers.
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is we don't yet. And just to kind of bring you behind the curtain of some of the challenges that we had in creating the survey, because I'm sure there's a ton of folks on the line that may have advice for us as we think about replicating this in 2021. We started to ask a question about kind of like which population does your company serve? And, we kind of listed out different groups, whether it was women or the LGBTQ population, minority populations, separately the Medicaid population. But what we found is it was hard I think we were looking for companies that were kind of exclusively focused on serving some of those populations, but we got our interpretation of the data was there was a lot more than we expected. And so we think that leaders were interpreting that more as like, could our solution be applicable to those populations, even if they weren't exclusively or currently serving them? So anyway, we didn't end up reporting out that data. Our intent was there, but I don't think that we executed it in a way where we were getting accurate information. So certainly can't yet draw the line to what you're talking about between, does having diverse leadership mean that there's going to be more solutions built for underrepresented groups and ultimately better outcomes for them? I think intuition and what I've heard from a lot of people a lot smarter than me is yes, that it really matters. I think there's an abundance of literature about the kind of power of diverse teams in driving business outcomes. And I think you have organizations like Health Tech for Medicaid that is really intentionally, and they're one of the resources that Rachel linked to, that is intentionally supporting diverse founders, because when they look at, for instance, the Medicaid population, there are a lot of women, there are a lot of people of color. And so just wanting to find innovators that are really close to that lived experience. I also think it's important on the flip side, where as we diversify who investors are, I think also important to realize that a lot of investors are still white. And so one thing that we think about, for instance, at Rock Health, is how do we not just think about the problems to solve that resonate with our own lived experience? How do we stay curious, and how do we stay really in kind of that, question mode of trying to deeply understand the experiences and issues raised by somebody else, so that we can start to understand the case for a potential market that maybe we haven't seen or we haven't invested in, but is going to be really powerful. So I think, Katie, that it's incredibly important, especially given how healthcare disparities have been so exposed across the past 12 months. But it's not something yet that that Rock Health at least can link with data, though it's definitely something I'd be interested in seeing if others are looking at that. Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Katie, I appreciate your question, especially right off the bat. I think the heart of your question is, why does this matter? why does this matter for patients, right? Why does this matter for healthcare? Why does this matter for digital medicine? It's a very fair question, and I'm glad for the opportunity to ask this, because I answer this question a lot by myself in the shower sometimes about why it's important to have a field that's inclusive and a field that proclaims to do the work for patients. I'd like to take a second and talk about that a little bit. So we had seen previously that most of the folks who work in healthcare, let's just do a healthcare focus here. Most of the folks who work in healthcare, and especially digital medicine too, are white folks. Historically, it's white folks who've had access to higher education. And that leads to just a different kind of reality for different kinds of folks too. And as we've also seen in the past, that a lot of research is done only on white participants. So it seems as though the story has been, in medicine, medical products made by white people for white people, right? And so if we think about that, that feels a little unfair. It feels there's not a lot of justice in that. And so if we think about, well, why? A lot of products are fantastic and they work really well, and that's really great. But whenever we think about top down, what does it look like? People who are creating these products, it looks primarily homogenous. And that means that products are created with teams who maybe look alike, creating the same kinds of things that help the same kind of people. And a great way to kind of break up that thinking is simply diversity on teams. How do companies look at things differently? And looking at how companies look at things differently is based primarily upon who is driving these companies. What does a team makeup look like? What are the different kinds of schools? How do they teach things differently, and not just a handful of the elite universities, right? Now there's great, of course, I'm not trying to put any group down or say any group is better than another, but I think it's interesting to see where has historically resources been in this country, and also how does that distill down into the current and persistent healthcare disparities that still exist. And so I think part of the reason that the Rock Health report is so fantastic, because it's a great benchmark at a very unique time in this country. And it also allows us to move forward. But also part of the point of providing some of those resources to show is how we can help each other, and how other kinds of minority founders can also think about things differently. So thank you for that question, Katie. It's really important, and one that I think any organization worth any kind of worth in healthcare and digital medicine is required to have these conversations to actually help all patients. So I appreciate that question. We'll go ahead and move on to another one too. We've got a question here from Casey. Casey is one of our Rockstar Dime members here. Casey, can you unmute yourself and ask your question live?
Yes,
Awesome.
Obviously, because you're hearing me. Yeah, my question is around one of the ways that, it's sort of a sideways, a back doorway, but a way to make Rock Health more of a source for these folks who are kind of left off, far away from the table, particularly in venture stuff, when they're looking for help putting together their whatever it is they're building. Do you guys, Rock Health, have any end user, what I call patients, or actually what I call people, any patient or end user communities to help founders connect with those end users from diverse populations? Because partnerships with communities like that seems to me to be one way that you could start to break down these walls and berms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I think we as investors are looking for founders who have kind of cracked that nut pretty early. Because I think from our standpoint, it's, there is oftentimes a path to grow your product through a commercially insured population. And I think that's important. It can be incredibly powerful for scale, and it can transform a lot of people's lives for the better. But I also think that, we're really interested in whether a solution can be applied to a Medicaid population, a population of folks that, have multiple chronic conditions that, may be less likely for social determinants of health reasons to, be compliant, we say, to a particular care plan. And so it's really important to us that that the solutions that we're investing in have been thoughtful about how they're connecting into those populations and proving out, validating that their solution can work. A good example is a company, Arene. They're a digital pharmacy manager. And again, instead of kind of just running out a commercial population, a couple of their first contracts were actually with state Medicaid programs to essentially help people make sure that, one, they have the appropriate care plan, two, that they're supported in, whether it's taking certain drugs or adhering to certain dietary recommendations, having to check in with a provider, making sure that they had the support to lead that healthier life. And they've had incredible outcomes. So that's really, really important to us. I think to explicitly answer your question, but it's really intriguing to ponder what it would look like. We don't necessarily have kind of existing populations that we would plug entrepreneurs into. But we do have, general relationships, whether it's with folks that work in Medicaid, with folks at Health Tech for Medicaid, with California Healthcare Foundation, who's really focused on the Medi-Cal population in California. So we certainly do try to make sure that our founders are thinking about validating and serving those communities and making the right connections to make it happen. But I've never kind of explicitly heard the idea as clearly as you put it, in terms of being a vehicle to connect founders to those communities that they may want to be serving.
I got a huge network. Get in touch with
Yeah.
me if you ever want to fire that up.
Awesome. Thank you. Would love to chat more.
Love it. Awesome. Thanks, Casey. Thanks, Megan. I'd like to give the floor to Adam Brown. He is the CEO of a company named Clinarch. Adam, would you mind unmuting yourself, turning on your camera and jumping in?
Absolutely. Can you hear me? My camera is not the best today.
It's not happy today. Great.
Yeah,
Well, we
sorry.
can hear you. No problem.
But yeah, so, I appreciate you all for, having me speak today and getting I just want to take this time to share my perspective and also tell you, what my company does. So my company, Clinarch, we specialize in, site identification and patient recruitment. And I'm actually a Black man. And I had to bootstrap my company starting in, I founded my company in May of 2019. And a lot of the data that you showed really was eye-opening for me, because it really explained my experience for me and why I was experiencing those things. For me, I reached out to a bunch of investors and it was like crickets. So, and I also, you have no other way to go as a minority. So you have to try and work, your regular job and try and get your company, your dream going, essentially. So by me starting my own company, I was then fired from, my regular employment right before COVID. So I was pushed out into a situation where, I have a kid, I have a wife, and you're out there and you don't have mentors, and the data that you're showing is just like, you don't have mentors, you don't have the capital, and it's literally sink or swim, figure it out, and you also have to think about culture shock and all these things that go into being in a room where people do not look like you, they don't talk like you, they don't, it's just, the communication is not there. And it's not because we're not smart enough to understand what's being said, it's just that we communicate differently. We come from a different environment. And I think in the science field, using my company as example, you all said, does it work? Or, how do we, why is this important? Well, my company, we just got our first contract during COVID and it was in sickle cell. And we all know sickle cell is very hard to recruit. Studies are lucky if they can get a handful of people. Well, in a month, we were able to, all of them didn't qualify, but we were able to get, 8 referrals in 30 days. And that's because we sat down, my team sat down, we would go and talk to people, have empathy. But that empathy is only there because I know what it feels like to be from that community. I know what it feels like to go to a school with no resources. I know what it feels like to, sleep in my car, or I know, so these different things that I can pull upon and really relate to people, that share my experience. So yeah, investing in minority companies is important because it's going to help you. But you have to be patient enough to to understand that you have to also, develop develop that relationship, understand that that person has to develop as well to catch up with you, because we come from a situation where we don't even have access to information that you have access to. And it's just, we don't know that certain things exist, because I've been in situations where I will tell a sponsor an idea and they say, oh, that already exists. But I literally created that idea out of my mind. I just didn't know that it was there. So it's like, had I had access to the resources to know that those things already exist, then I would probably come up with something better or whatever. I just didn't know it was there. So I think, my whole point in just, saying these things is just that, supporting minority businesses does matter. It helps. I started my business with $4,000. No investor messaged me back. Thank God I got a contract during COVID, and it's in sickle cell, and, it's not easy, and it takes more than just, throwing money into the company. You have to also look at the community that we come from. They need more opportunities to even understand research, to even know that I didn't know clinical research existed until I was 20. You know what I mean? So it's a lot more than just, investing in the business. We have to make sure that the people have the dream of creating the business before we even, get to that point. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you so much for, letting me speak. And I hope I was just able to share some insight or something.
Thank you. Like, that's mainly what I want to say, Adam. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's just incredibly, incredibly powerful. And hearing kind of the story, so much more powerful than any data we could gather and share. And I think what you're saying really made me think of some of the conversations that we had with kind of other founders of color and investors. And one thing, so I should have mentioned this up front. I did mention Dr. Ivor Horn, but she was an incredible partner to us throughout this journey. I also wanted to call out Payal Parikh, who was our research fellow that worked on this. Certainly, it was a team effort. And one thing that Dr. Horn always says, she's an angel investor specifically focused on women of color. She's also a mentor and advisor. And she often says that, the advice that sometimes people get is a little surface level. It's not really giving you the inside scoop of how to navigate, what to expect in a pitch. And she said that kind of like real talk about the experience is so critically important just to prepare people. Just so that, when they go into the room, there isn't as much, there was still maybe some culture shock. I think I'm still intimidated when I walk into, some offices of these VCs, but, to kind of lessen that and make sure that folks are really prepared and just being admittedly a little more frank about like, hey, your pitch deck isn't there, but like, here's how we're going to get it there. So that really honest mentorship, I think, is critically important. And also, I mean, you made the point, just your incredible story of resilience, of bootstrapping a company. Congrats on your client that you signed, having success. I mean, there's so much resilience there. So even if, this is, Ivor also talks about this a lot, it's, having investors that recognize that kind of the same pedigree over and over again is going to create pattern matching that's going to replicate what we're seeing in our data, that just certain types of people, white men for the most part, are going to be funded. And so having curiosity to understand kind of the grit and tenacity that some of these groups need to have just to get to the point that others are already at is incredibly important, and honestly what you would want in a founding team. So again, Adam, just really appreciate you sharing.
Oh, thank you for the work that you're doing. I really appreciate it, and you really shedding light on this stuff. Awesome.
Thanks for sharing, Adam. Megan, I've got some questions for you. I've got lots of questions. Just really, your report's really fantastic, and I really appreciate your work along with Pyle's and Dr. Horn's too. So I have a question too about, you mentioned the data collection period that y'all had for this report. Can you remind us again when the data collection period ended, just about in 2020?
Yes. Man, putting me on the spot. I'm not going to remember the specific date, but I'm pretty sure that it was in this early September timeline. We opened it earlier summer, I want to say. June, July, August were kind of primary data collection periods.
Fantastic. So that you collected the data throughout most of 2020 and you were able to capture the snapshot of 2020 super well. I really like that. Some of the things that stand out to me too is the data, and I'm cheating and I'm going back to my screen and going back to the data because I want to bring that up too. Well, so first, can we take a moment and can you briefly explain bootstrapping to anyone who may not be completely sure?
Oh yeah, so the idea, and I'll contrast it to venture capital, and Adam, feel free to chime in given your experience here, but contrast it to venture capital, we are going to outside investors to give you capital for your company in exchange for partial ownership of that company. That's, of course, the return that the investors are hoping to get based on their ownership if and when this company becomes successful. Different than bootstrapping, where you're really kind of using your own capital to invest in a company and not taking capital from external investors. So one thing, you would retain 100% ownership of your company, but depending on your own financial situation, may not have that much capital to be able to pour in. Adam, hopefully I can bring this up again, but having to work 2 jobs or having to start a job on the side, just to make sure that you have
taking a high interest loan.
Yeah, exactly. Also, taking loans that you're going to be responsible for paying back if when the time comes.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan, for explaining that.
Yeah, of course.
I'd like to kind of have this conversation a little bit more explicitly. We talked about it a little bit with Katie, and I also like to ask this question to anyone else too on the line who has some ideas. I know we've got some really great members in our DIME community. So this is a question for you guys too, if you'd like to chime in too. Just unmute yourself or kind of raise your hand in the chat. But I'd like to think about, what does this mean really for digital medicine? What does this mean for healthcare? What does this mean for patients? Bernadette, you popped in here in the chat. I'm going to ask if you can unmute yourself, and would you like to provide any more commentary? You have great experience in this field, and I'd love to hear more from you.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm still trying to build my experience, and somehow I missed the time frame, so I came in a little bit late. So I hope I'm going to have the opportunity to get the presentation again from the DIME website. But what, from my experience over the past 12 to 18 months is, one, they expect the concept of digital health trying to be the motto to provide health access to specific communities is from one side looks a little bit simplistic, but the moment you realize that we have already some discrepancies between health access to the communities, and if you have to empower communities, some communities also have to have ownership of the ideas on how to deliver the health services. So the digital health becomes a tool. And like any other tool, you need investment and you need time. And going back to what Adam said, at times, I am here, I'm an African based in Europe, and trying to, so that's why my focus on digital health. At the beginning, I thought it is something easy. It is enough to provide some apps or web-based services. But I came to realize that there are many other things. It might be similar to some rural communities in Germany or to some rural communities in the US, but specifically, the social determinants of health will not be erased because it is digital. All those biases that come from lack of wealth, lack of wealth within the community, lack of education, becomes also an issue. So it takes some sort of, let me not say, those that are within the venture capital area or those that are willing to invest in the aspect of health for all, they also have to, we have to somehow push people forward to the area of trying to engage with the community and giving room. And just like Casey said, giving room for those that are willing to go that mile, that extra mile, like Adam and people like myself also, to say, okay, where can we hook in? Because when it comes now to certain part of regulatory or guidelines, there are certain experiences that me from a scientific background are not having that. But on the other hand, we need that academic background to be able to, and that needs extra funding. And then now having to have that network of going through that process is an issue. I might talk on that far too much. So let me just say, all the biases within the health system now will not be erased just because it is within the digital aspect. So we have to intentionally address that and try to see how we get in those that are willing to go the extra mile and for assistance. That's why networking is now important. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Bernadette. And also, thanks for joining. And I wasn't expecting to have European colleagues on the line, so that's awesome that you're joining. It reminds me a little bit of some work that our consulting team did. It's actually somewhat related to Adam's work, where the team was asked by a biopharma company to help them think through how to diversify recruitment for clinical trials, and do so in a way that reflected the impact of disease and illness on certain populations, and making sure that the trials would be representative of those populations when they're testing new interventions. And what they found is, like, it's really difficult to define a population simply by one dimension, whether that's age or race or region, that it can be really local and really takes earning trust with folks by showing an understanding of their community and connecting into that community. So to your point, a lot of the recommendations weren't necessarily around digital recruitment tools. Some of them were, but some of it was just around, partnering with leaders in people's communities, whether that's religious organizations, whether that's schools, even, I've heard of some interesting health interventions tried in partnership with local barbershops. So places that people are frequenting regularly, where they trust, where they feel that, they're a part of that community. And I think, Bernadette, also you're bringing up a critical topic this year of, I think folks have been calling it the digital divide, of not assuming that everyone's going to have access to the tools that are going to allow for virtual care experiences, even though we did kind of have this mad dash of doctors and patients saying, hey, we need a safe space to access care that isn't our overflowing EDs and physician offices. Let's figure out what this looks like. But I think we still have a ways to go in terms of ensuring access and also connecting it to an in-person experience. I don't think we believe that everything's going to go virtual. We're moving towards a more hybrid integrated model.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, everyone, for all of your feedback. I hope that this continues to be a conversation everywhere, not just for minorities and other really fantastic groups like Rock Health, but I hope this conversation really does continue. Part of the power of DIME is, of course, our community involvement, and from all the feedback coming from every single one of our members and the rock stars, even on the call today right now. I'd like to tease a little bit too about some future work that DIME is offering, and we'll be talking about this. We'll be announcing it tomorrow. So here's a little bit of a sneak peek. What we're doing too is DIME is involved in a consortia, a group with other tech leaders to think about health access and literacy for digital medicine and for digital health. And I'm saying that because we would like DIME sits on this group too. We'll give more information about what that is, but we'd like to also harness the power and the expertise of our community to bring back to those conversations. And I say that because what DIME is offering monthly is we're building an open forum, kind of a roundtable for all of our members to join live to talk about DE&I in digital health, what works, what doesn't, what are we seeing in the field with patients or with tech developers or with investments, kind of have these open conversations so that we can all be more connected and to help move the field forward. So keep in mind, keep your eyes open. We'll be announcing some more information about that tomorrow, and a place to keep continuing our appetite for these really important conversations. Thank you everyone for your fantastic feedback too. And I'd like to thank Megan for your fantastic and your very hard work. I'm not sure if you guys are teeing up for a 2021 report, but I'm telling you, I'm keeping my eyes open for it if it comes out. I'm sure there'll be really great things to share there too. And so what I'd like to do here is tease up some more of the information that we've got going on. So great thank you to Megan. And while we close out, Megan, did you have a closing word for us before I jump to some more Dime closeout?
Just a huge thank you. I think our intention with this was to bring kind of precision and clarity to these kind of issues and disparities that we're dealing with, and also to spark conversation. We're one voice among many in this community, and we do intend to continue this work. So as you have ideas, suggestions for us, please do feel free to reach out. I'm just Megan at rockhealth.com. And yeah, for folks that are interested, definitely encourage you to take a look at the report.
Awesome, Megan. I'm going to assert for Dime that we'd be happy to be a distribution partner too, whenever for any future ones too. So please holler at me whenever that gets ready.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. So generous.
Oh gosh, you guys are doing great research. We're so happy for it. Very aligned on these same what's important here. Okay, great. So thank you for that, Megan. I'd like to do some quick closeout here to make sure we end on time. We don't take up any more folks this time. And so we have, of course, our next webinar is how digital medicine is changing global healthcare. And so we're partnering with Startup Health with three of their founders. And so we've got Miguel Johns, who is doing diabetes care throughout Latin America and globally through machine learning. Brian Mazue, who is creating pharmacies of the future and transforming drug access in Nigeria. And we'll be closing out too with Rayla Martin, who is co-founder and CEO, delivering a digital therapeutic providing culturally sensitive mental health care to the United States. So check that out. It will be next month, February 17th. We hope to see you here again. And of course, always with the content, we got another, our next journal club too, will be on February 2nd about a publication from JAMA, about the need to assess benefits, risk, and values for all the products that we're developing in digital health. So please join us as we include our esteemed panelists here. All right, so that's close out. That's everything. Thanks everyone for joining us today. And we really appreciate you being involved in Dime and for your hour today. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.